Hello. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for coming and thank you for sitting in this baking heat and bearing with me. I am going to read 3 short excerpts from the manifesto, and Stefanie will very kindly translate them. Let's put it this way. I know what I don't want. I know what it's not. It's not protest in the sense that it's not attempting to persuade or to convince. It's not an awareness-raising exercise. Face it, we are way past the point of diagnosing the problem. On the one hand, it might be a way of squatting the sanctioned structures of the English language, of forcing that unhomely home to make room for me, just as a derelict office block might become a makeshift gallery or community cafe, so too might English be occupied and repurposed through poetry. On the other hand, it might be that the written word is not a territory one can ever truly inhabit, but a pre-existing system one must labour to expose. That is to say, the poem is never at rest within English, that I am never at rest. The poem is provisional, contingent, continually wrestling with a language that attempts in its various ways to assail, resist, or evict me. A poetry of militant restlessness, a poetry of feral vigour. When I talk about poetry, when I talk about working class poetry in particular, I'm thinking about this. I know what I don't want. A collection of deathless, undead, inert, immaculate verses to be carted around like dusty lyric freight. In other words, I harbour a deep suspicion of the well-made poem, the binding authority of received forms. I seek instead a poetry that staggers and sprawls, a poetry that stores the signs and scars of the life and work that produced it, a tactile repository of labour, joy and grief. Poem to be built from the abusive repetitions of labour, the obscene rhythms of work, work, work. Poem to be made from wobbly lines of errant attention, running like the sloppy seam on a cheap print skirt across the space of a page. Poem to be cobbled and botched from a rag bag of silky fixings, suddenly snagged on a hangnail of text. I don't want tasteful Tupperware poems. I want clashing colours, mismatched patterns, staticky man-made fabrics, schlock, stink. Poem to sing what is poorly made. A poverty of means in excess of expression. Our survivalist swagger, our doomed punk strut. I want a poetry that will demand more of its readers than unconscious, uncritical absorption. When I speak about poetry, I desire something difficult, something to be born with, a place of active and discomforted attention. I want grotesques, not tragedies. The suffering, sick, necrotic body rendered visible upon the space of the page. I want the dead and the dying, so often cannibalized by the poem's lyric sustenance and transformed into bland, disembodied traces to return to us, repulsive to look at and think about. And I want rage. Rage like a fire in a meth lab, burning.
Sagen wir so, ich weiß, was ich nicht will. Ich weiß, was sie nicht ist. Sie ist kein Protest, der überreden oder überzeugen will. Sie ist auch keine Awareness-Übung. Seid euch im Klaren darüber, wir sind längst über den Punkt der Problemdiagnose hinaus. Einerseits könnte sie helfen, die sanktionierten Strukturen der englischen Sprache zu besetzen, einzubrechen in dieses unwirtliche Zuhause, um sich dort einen Raum zu schaffen. So wie ein baufälliges Bürohaus als Galerie oder Gemeinschaftscafé genutzt wird, so könnte auch das Englische durch Poesie besetzt und umfunktioniert werden. Andererseits könnte es sein, dass das geschriebene Wort gar kein Ort ist, der sich je benutzen oder bewohnen ließe, sondern ein bereits vorgegebenes System, an dem man sich abarbeiten muss, um es bloßzulegen. Das heißt, das Gedicht ruht nie innerhalb der englischen Sprache. Ich ruhe nie. Das Gedicht ist provisorisch, möglich, ringt unaufhörlich mit einer Sprache, die versucht, mich zu überfallen, sich mir zu widersetzen, mich zwangszuräumen. Eine Poesie militanter Rastlosigkeit, eine Poesie ungezähmter Tatkraft. An eine solche Poesie denke ich, wenn ich von Poesie rede, besonders von jener der Arbeiterinnenklasse. Ich weiß, was ich nicht möchte. Eine Sammlung todloser, untoter, träger, makelloser Verse, die umhergekarrt werden wie verstaubte lyrische Fracht. Mit anderen Worten, ich hege ein tiefes Misstrauen gegenüber dem gut gemachten Gedicht, gegenüber der verbindlichen Autorität anerkannter Formen. Ich trachte stattdessen nach einer Poesie, die taumelt und wuchert, einer Poesie, in der sich die Zeichen und Narben des Lebens und Arbeitens abzeichnen, das sie hervorbrachte. Ein greifbares Lager voller Arbeit, Freude und Trauer. Ein Gedicht noch zu bauen aus dem Missbrauch repetitiver Arbeit, aus den obszönen Rhythmen des Arbeitens, Arbeitens, Arbeitens. Ein Gedicht noch zu bauen aus den schwankenden Zeilen einer fahrigen Aufmerksamkeit, die wie der schlotterige Saum eines billig bedruckten Rocks über den Raum der Seite laufen. Ein Gedicht geflickt und gestümpert aus einem Lumpensack mit seidigen Beilagen, rasch an einen Nietnagel von Text gehängt. Bloß keine geschmackvollen Tapperdosengedichte. Schrille Farben, inkongruente Muster, statisch aufgeladene, handgemachte Stoffe. Ramsch, Mief, ein Gedicht, das besingt, was mangelhaft gefertigt ist. Den Kapitalmangel, den Überschuss an Ausdruck, unsere Überlebensprahlerei, unser fluchbeladenes Punkprotzen. Ich will eine Poesie, die mehr von ihren Leserinnen verlangt als unbewusste, unkritische Versunkenheit. Wenn ich von Poesie spreche, dann wünsche ich mir etwas Schwieriges, etwas, mit dem man geboren wird, einen Ort aktiver, unbehaglicher Aufmerksamkeit. Ich möchte Grotesken, keine Tragödien, den leidenden, kranken, nekrotischen Körper, der auf dem Raum der Seite sichtbar wird. Ich will, dass die Toten und Sterbenden, die so häufig vom Gedicht als lyrischer Nährwert kannibalisiert und zu nichtssagenden, entkörperten Spuren gemacht werden, zu uns zurückkehren, uns abstoßen, wenn wir sie ansehen oder über sie nachdenken. Und ich will Zorn. Zorn wie ein Brand in einem Meth-Labor, voll entflammt.
Danke, Stefanie. It has been suggested to me that I read a section of a poem in English. I'll confine myself to one because we don't have a translation. But this is a poem that's called Leave the Capital. Dismissed from its pedant republics at last, convulsing and doubled, clumsily thrust between buses, a girl going, "Io, Io," the throat unburdens itself of arrows. All of its wrecked formidables, her moon stompers, oi inverted, pours out of herself. I hear the way her pleasures tear. In pubs, those ashtray mafias, ashtray tryhards running a numb hand up her slick no-brainer on Wanker's Wharf, and a scant tree in the misfire of an eye, to be all muscle and no memory, the Thames a degraded membrane, sick neurotic twitch. In pubs they will open her body, a versatile blade, their dictionary of cigarettes, the aptly translated lie, clever boys. The flawless, disaffected pause that passes for lotus cheaters, compress us into a 5-point plan for progress, to preside over and haunt this ballad of cladding and scaffold, our tender silos burning, breathe it in, the jinxed blueprint of it crossing the urn in its amours, Grenfell, Greenfield, missold. In syllable and in tissue, such sky, misfold, dismissed and turning, little grief of methods and permissions, all roads lead to, circle and spill, the quotidian acute, and no roads shall abide its winding, the limit and eclipse of money. will be anchored and then discarded, to break, if not free, then thorough over the Medway, the blue-brown stretcher of small resentments, a golden rusk of light skimmed succumbing dream of an elsewhere we call Berlin, moonwalk the mouth through its thin obituary Deutsch, pretend to a summer of priory walls, necrotic couch surf, a carnivorous species of great unwashed, alone there with all of his sovereign insomnias and the sun, expectant brute, banging his tin drum, waiting for us to, falling, spectacle of last resort radio, archive of grating feudal melodies, want to be neutralised in suits to the tune of an airless oh baby and celebrate dead versions. You wouldn't be the first averted eye to enter the big world and crack. Says go if you're going, sulky wastrel facepalm, London is paradise with a slow puncture, and that's on a good day. Stagnant apprehensions, burials, peak liberal dog shit, thwart gobs stinging with public apology, or the hot pink mess of cynical allyship, those bastions of homicidal price gouge, their staple of rainbow tawdries, and wow, look at us, heat-seeking and sealed against empathy, was feebly monstered, laughed up as nullified guts, going, which side are you on? Eyes like sterilised zygotes, eyes like dash cams, lidless thicket of eyes, fucker. Why so in love with this syndrome of sides, like error into anvil, like a face vaguely razored, like munitions components, oracles, have anything to do with the pained miraculous expansion of being in a body, or what you mean by nature, depredations, rotting, modalities dismissed. This is not a country, but an industry, shining and shouting, the brain is a hutch, the brain is a kennel, there is nothing to love here but things. She says, with my rage, I could bend girders of bone. A golden ticket taped over the mouth, battle hymn hemispheres, this is where it hurts. In a city, furtive and permanent, in flame but depleted, lie on your side in a high-ceilinged room, tidally miscarried. Hell has many mouths. To survive entails a mutation. And is it any wonder, working your gorge like a pro, aberration unceasing, buildings rise like ultimatums, a textbook of trick questions, accountants' disclaimers? Is it any wonder, your future, that important blue you wipe yourself on, synthetic death, backhanders, switcheroos, put your finger on the problem. Poem, extravagantly roving slut. If this is what we made with words, are we sure? If this is what we made with words, are we sure it is a country? If this is what we made with words, are we sure it is the country we want to escape, and not language itself? Like you were a dirty old man, Hugh Crane, and you built a dirty house. Like trying to make thoughts from the caw, the corona, extracellular aggregates, placky snarl around the stem of speech. We'll go from city to city, establish our Achilles future with serene effect. Oh, horrors. Plotline of pigs, preface of weeds, chorus of dead, ethereal twinks. Row upon row of mad, capacitated crowns, royal babies, this basket of corrosives down in one. The capital. Its toxicity is mere but extreme. A bad luck that travels as both particle and wave. Backwards, lacking, locked into, cancelled. There's that word again. Has the stink of endowment all over it. Thank you. This is Stefan, he's not just some random from the audience who's joined me. He is meant to be here. We're going to have a conversation. It's going to be epic.
Hello, good evening. I would first like to thank the organizers of the festival, and especially Ulrike Taus, who invited me. And I would like to thank Fran for being here, for her writing and her reading. I'm very pleased to be given the opportunity to be in conversation with you. And I would like to start with a question about your practice, or your practices, I should perhaps say, which obviously is related as a question to the question of work, which is quite central to the festival. So, actually, there are two sides to the question. One is quite practical, and it's really a question about the various things that you're doing besides writing poetry. And in order to be able to write poetry, and this is exactly what connects with the question of work, because the question of work or labor is not only a question about whether or not one is working when producing art, writing literature, writing poetry, but it is in the world we live in, and we've been living in for a long time now, is also a question of being able to sustain oneself. So the question of work is about possible remuneration that allows us to be able to sustain ourselves. And the question of work and of labor is about regimes of labor. Yeah. And these regimes are shifting regimes of labor. I was thinking, when preparing for this conversation, I was thinking, just to give you one example, which is directly related to the situation in the UK in recent years, I was thinking of a poster campaign which some member of the Conservative Party, some Tory, had invented some 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And some of these posters were showing people from like classical, would be recognizable as working class jobs, whose work, however, was being made replaceable through ongoing processes of automation. But then there was one other poster which showed a young woman who quite obviously was a ballet dancer. And the text said, Fatima, that was the name given to her, Fatima's next job could be in cyber. She just doesn't know it yet. So you know this, right?
Yes.
You remember this. So I would like to ask you about these two sides of things, your individual activities, but also the collective side of your practice, because you're involved in collective projects as well, and how you navigate this question of work or labor, dealing with regimes of labor, shifting regimes of labor, in order to be able to live a poet's life.
A poet's life. Most of my life is not coming to lovely events like this and speaking. Most of my life is very, if possible, even more unglamorous. I'm very fortunate now in that all of the jobs that I do, and I do about 6 jobs of work, I'm very fortunate that they are all adjacent to something that I love, and this wasn't always the case. I came into a kind of arts and literary scene as a working class person, a person who, I'm the first person in my family to get a GCSE, let alone go to university, and having no financial safety net behind me, move into a world that is dominated by middle class creatives. Lovely people, but they have a safety net. They can afford to take time off work to focus on their art. And that's something that I couldn't do and have never really been able to do. Slightly more now, but certainly not when I was starting out. So I had to find an art form, right, that is going to accommodate that. So I chose poetry, because poetry communicates in fragments and flashes. You can write it standing up at the sink while you're washing dishes. You can jot something down with a piece of paper and a pen at 3 a.m. You don't need a great deal of time and resources to practice. So it's the perfect mode for perfect mode of production for those who are poor in those things. So that's, poetry sort of chose me in that way, really. As I've gone along, I've done a variety of different jobs, and this was the rage that people in the UK felt when that ad campaign came out with Fatima as the ballet dancer. And what they failed to appreciate is that most creatives, people like Fatima, and Fatima was a brown person, and in ballet that is extraordinary, a really hard place to occupy. So I know friends who are dancers, and it was a really, really difficult place to occupy, right? So, and if she's not a middle-class white lady, Fatima, she will, and I guarantee, she would have already been working 3 or 4 jobs. She doesn't need, and instead of, she's already got about 5 as well as is, right? And that was kind of the situation in the UK when those hideous things kind of incensed us all. It gave us something to be kind of like angry about for a while, which was nice, quite distracting. The world was on fire, everyone was dying. Let's just be furious at the Tories, it gives us life. My practice now is editing, commissioning, editing, teaching. The teaching is what I have to do. I like teaching. I'm not wild about marking. I'm not wild about the marketization of the academy. I'm not wild about the fact that self and students are being forced into this gross neoliberal framework which wants to make them consumers and you a service provider. I could do without that, but it's what you have to do. And I have my class now, we have a pledge that we will resist that framing with every fibre of our being going in, and try to make something in the teeth of this machine that wants to grind us all to paste. But I also do a variety of non-arty jobs, right? Like I've walked dogs, I've cleaned dishes, I've been a barista. That was very short-lived. I'm great at drinking coffee, as it turns out. That doesn't necessarily mean you're great at brewing it, or indeed dealing with the public. I was a barmaid for a while. I had another very sort of like side hustle selling military antiques. That was fun. But you do all of this stuff to support yourself, but also to legitimate yourself in the eyes of your working class family, who look at you when you say, I want to be a poet, age 12, and like, well, no, because no, that's not a real job. And you end up in this state of sort of self-induced schizophrenia because your life, the thing that has sweetness and meaning to you, the thing that you want to go out into the world and matter and mean, is not considered real by the people you love and by the community that you love. So I'm very stubborn, and when people tell me I can't do something, I am going to dig my heels in, and it might be ill-advised, but I'm going to do it. So people told me I couldn't do a PhD. Well, you don't have the money, you can't do a PhD. So I went away, and I worked every shitty job I could find, and they were shitty. And this is not valorising me. This is to say the system sucks, and we shouldn't have to do that. That nobody should have to, like, seriously at 3 a.m. be lying there considering prostitution in order to go and fund higher education. Nobody should have to do that. Nobody, right? But went away and worked every single shitty job that I could in order to be able to do that, and it took years. So as a consequence now, I'm knackered, and I've been lapped on the way to the exit by younger, more affluent people than myself. And as I get older and my energy wears out, I can't do a lot of the jobs that I used to be able to do to make money. So, like, kind of like stacking shelves and running up and down ladders and like spending hours on your feet in your 40s going through menopause is not hugely viable, right? It's not great. Nobody wants to do that. And that labour exhausts you for the work of your labour. So I'm trying to kind of make inroads into academia, which is... it's resistant. I have all the sad statistics for how often a person like me gets to be in a place like that, and I keep that ever before me like a ticking lamp all the time, just because, you know, if I give up and I say this is too hard, I'm going to go work in Sainsbury's, or, you know, this is too hard, I'm going to quit and I'm going to do something, literally anything else. I tried working in an office once, that was fun. It felt like I was being slowly poisoned, cannot recommend, hard pass. I could say I could give up and I could go and do that, but I think that there are a queue of people stretching halfway around the block that want you to give up, and I'm not going to do their work for them, and neither should anyone else. So I think that's kind of bringing me neatly to what I try to do with my editing practice now. So I am formerly associate, now commissioning editor at the Radical Arts and Culture Cooperative, Culture Matters. And we offer a platform online, but also we support working class artists with the publication of books. We're entirely funded by donations from individual members. We're not funded by the Arts Council. The Arts Council don't give us any money because we keep saying nasty things about them and calling them the Arts Council. But we, and also because we want to remain critical of that system, we want to be able to talk about the way in which grants and awards are awarded, and that there is a London bias, that there is a kind of a bias towards art forms that middle-class people typically engage in, and that this is not right. And so we're funded entirely by donations, and we do little fundraising events as well. And working with other people is a way of, like, you know, just keeping your elbow out and your foot in the door, just to say, you know, if nobody else is going to listen to you, we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and we're going to talk to ourselves and amongst ourselves. And it doesn't matter. We don't need the middle classes to validate us as important or special. We can write for ourselves and for each other. And that's the work I'm trying to do there. It is often like pushing a boulder uphill, but it's good work. It's the Lord's work.
Thank you for this. I think it's important that you're talking about these stories, because it gives a much thicker understanding of what you're addressing when you're talking about the working class in a manifesto for working class poetics. And I know from you that when using that notion of the working class, you're looking into much broader and much longer histories than what is sometimes solely associated with the working class in certain historical understandings or political rhetorics. And like one of the questions closely tied to the question about the working class in your work is surely about poverty, about being poor. And I was thinking upon rewatching Chantal Akerman's film J'ai faim, j'ai froid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, that one may well add I'm poor, right, to that. And that's where the impetus for a working class manifesto may come from, or thinking about the working class. I would like to ask you, though, to perhaps a little bit to that notion of the working class as you understand it, but also to perhaps speak a little bit to the question why you chose the particular form of a manifesto.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose thinking, when I use the word working class, I think I use it in a slightly different way than a lot of people in the UK still to this day use it. When they talk about the working class, they talk about mainly men engaged in manual or industrial labour. Still, even though that's hardly a thing anymore. I'm thinking about women who are engaged in sex work. I'm thinking about people in the service industry, migrant communities who are doing cash in hand, under the table work, people who are sort of living on the kind of the margins of society. Not everybody who is working class is poor. Also, this is the other thing to say. There are people who are working class who are like, they've had a similar set of educational opportunities to me, and they've gone on and done something eminently more sensible, like they've become plumbers or brickies, and they like my cousins they know a trade, right? So it's not a sort of like, endless escalating parade of poverty pornography to be working class. It's not all tragedy and grim, grotty grind, but a lot of it is. Because what we have now, I think, particularly in the UK and in Ireland, in the north of Ireland especially, is this intersection of kind of your class heritage with grinding precarity. There are no jobs in any sector, and we've all got to fight each other for the positions that are available. Everything has become a casualised gig, so we're scrabbling for purchase constantly, which is the other thing that exhausts you, right? Because you're doing that, you're not putting your energy into organising and protesting, you're not doing creative work because you're just running in place on that treadmill. I feel like I'm not saying anything that people here don't know. So when I use the word working class, I want to encompass a whole broad spectrum of people. Everyone who is finding it harder, I think, and everyone from my neck of the woods, everyone's finding it harder now, and whether that's they're competing with 500 other people for scraps, or whether there simply isn't the work. I mean, even in academia, we're in what I call end days academia now. I feel like we've gone past dark academia. This is the end, children. It's the end. And I know you and I were talking earlier, Stefan, about one of the things that I enjoy doing with my spare time is reading medieval history and medieval poets. And I am obsessed with a fellow by the name of Thomas Hockleaf. Thomas Hockleaf has a poem, it's called The Complaint. It's in his series. And he is writing about the crisis of academia and the emergence of the clerical precariat in the 1400s. It comes round again. And it keeps coming round again. There is a shortage of jobs. People are trained, people are skilled, but there's nobody that wants to pay us for that work, and that work has been systematically devalued. So yeah, that's where I am with that. Me and Thomas Hockleaf. But yeah,
I'd like to ask you about directly in relation to the manifesto and to some passages you've just read, and also to the poem Leave the Capital. And I'm very glad you chose that particular poem because I was going to quote from that poem myself. I'd like to ask you about your approach to language. And actually I'd like to introduce that question by quoting from the manifesto. I don't believe that this was part of the reading. I might be mistaken. Might have been inattentive. So the passage reads, "No one asked to live inside of language. It was like this when we got here, prior to us, belonging to someone else, subject to their rules, their laws. Let's say it was broken and set before we ever got a chance to use it." And I've been quite impressed by the way the multifaceted way you approach language, you deal with language, and certain passages in what you've just read speak very much to this as well. And I'd like to suggest that there are at least 3 different layers to that grappling or wrestling, as you yourself call it in one of your texts, with language. The first is a grappling with language as representation, one could say. But representation not only in an abstract sense, but rather as representation in the sense of an order of what can and what cannot be said, an order of representability, or even of presentability, in a symbolic presentability, one could say. So language thus appears almost like an occupying force, an occupying force that occupies us before we are able even able to approach language and use language, as you say in that passage. But then again, on the other hand, and that was part of the passages you read, you consider language at the same time as something that can be occupied in different sense, i.e. squatted, and populated with words that are unruly, that are precisely undermining the order of ruly words, the order of what can be said and what is not supposed to be said. So that's a first layer or level I'd like to mention. The second one is about the relation of language to affects and to emotional experiences, such as grief, anger, and woundedness, which is like in many of your texts. There is a text in this book also which is about wound. And especially in relation to woundedness, in relation to something, some kind of emotional experience, deep feeling that, as you write, must remain unspoken. So it's not only about, turning what cannot be said into something that is spoken. It's also about dealing with the fact that some things cannot be spoken and must not be, must remain unspoken, as you write in this passage. And then I'd like to add to this that you also, especially at the end, for example, at the end of the manifesto, you also speak of language as a place of great tenderness and as an alternative scene of imaginative solidarity. So it's also a possible place, a potential space of care, of new connections, right? And then there's a third level, which I found quite brilliantly formulated in a sentence I found in one of your texts in this book, White/Other, where you write, some people confuse language with English. And of course, particularly in the English-speaking countries, that's a very sharp and topical observation, one could say. And here, again, language appears as an occupying force, but in a historical political sense, which is particularly pertinent in relation to the history of the English language. And then again, there's a kind of counter-movement, it seems to me, in your writing, which is, again, to do with squatting, a movement of squatting, a squatting with slang words, for instance, squatting with obscene expressions, squatting with words taken from marginalized languages like Irish, like Yiddish, but also classical references or etymological considerations. And all of this forms a very peculiar and very interesting and very multifaceted way of dealing, of wrestling, to repeat that word, with language, which also welcomes a fragmentary character, the fragmentary character of your writing that you've just addressed, but also in terms of genres of writing, like sometimes very quick transitions from discursive types of texts to ephemeral, what I would like to, using again one of your words, what I would like to call ephemeral prose poetry. And so all of this, it's a very complex movement, and in the passage I wanted to quote from Leave the Capital, this poem that you just read, is to break, if not free, then thorough. And this breaking thorough, if not free, seems to describe very well these multiple ways of wrestling with language. So could you speak a little bit to this?
Yeah, I'll work backwards as what I'll do, and I'll start with, people confusing language with English, mainly English people, it has to be said. English people like to say things like iambic pentameter. When they talk about iambic pentameter in Shakespeare, they're like, because it's a natural speech rhythm. You're like, but whose speech rhythm is iambic pentameter naturally? Not mine. There's a whole host of people out there. There are other cultures and ways of looking at and doing things and articulating yourself that don't speak in iambic pentameter. And this is something I was trying to sort of get at. And then also, Stefanie had to do such a wonderful job translating my texts because I only have English. I like to joke that I have one language and it isn't mine. And I only have English because I went to a terrible, terrible, terrible state school. It was awful. I mean, like a succession of terrible, terrible state schools where you would sort of be taught a little bit of German and a little bit of French, but not really, because you weren't going to need them because, one, they all speak English over there anyway, this ambiguous over there that English people are in love with, and also because you, as a working class person, as a poor person, are never going to go anywhere. You don't need to have international conversations and build those solidarities with people because you're going to work in Tesco's. Goodbye. And there's that's still really embedded, I think, in the English school system even now. I really feel that. That there is, I think people kind of like, there's a particular strain of English person that is really clinging through like linguistic formulation to the concept that they still have an empire. It would be sweet if it wasn't so damaging, right? It would. But I really notice when people talk, we are not using language properly, or not using language correctly, or, you know, that what they mean is, you know, you're not using English in the way that I specifically approve of. And I never used to correct people, I just used to sit there and silently seethe, but now when someone does that, I do tell them, like, you're not saying what you actually mean, just say what you mean. Then we all know you're a bastard and we can move on. I want to come back to, so working backwards, grief, and wounding, and I think I got to a point where language, poetic language, was being asked to hold and carry a hell of a lot, right? It's the investigative medium into which we're using to excavate all this stuff and talk about like our trauma or our oppression or whatever, but it's also being asked to hold and console those things at the same time. And it's being asked to do so in a way that's been really debased. I mean, we all know that sentimental language can be used in a variety of horrifying ways, right? To coerce our consent and to bring us on side with some really disgusting ideas. And so I was thinking about, well, maybe some things, maybe some feelings can't go into text, and maybe what the writing's job therefore is just to point to the site of its own failure, to talk around that wound and that hole. And it's not so much like the old chestnut of trauma studies that it must remain unspoken, because I sometimes think people use that as a way of not looking at the problem. It's so horrific, we can't ever look at it. We can't ever talk about the Holocaust because it was so horrific. We can't ever talk about the Troubles and intergenerational trauma in the north of Ireland because it was so horrific and so terrible and it traumatized so many people. So we you know, and we're all traumatized, so we can't speak about it. Have you tried speaking about it and seeing what happens? And sometimes all you can do is try, and you know you're going to fail in that attempt, right? You know. The poem is doomed to failure. All of my poems, I consider them all doomed to failure. But you try anyway, and you see what you can make with the kind of ruins and the discard. And I think that's the breaking thorough. That's kicking something to pieces to see how it put back together. And you're never going to be able to put it back together, but what you have is the knowledge, and you know. And that's kind of, that's sort of priceless. Cycling backwards, representation, and the idea of representation. I suppose I'm thinking about, with the idea of representation in language as a kind of representing medium, the subjects that fall out of representation. the kinds of subjectivity or identity that are not held or are held in such a way that becomes imprisoning, coercive, deterministic, etc. And looking for the kind of looking for how that happens. What's the mechanism? How is that trick done? How do we become entrapped and how do we become entangled? And then putting pressure on the seams and kind of pulling it apart. And I think that's what the manifesto form is really good for. I think about the manifesto as being a kind of like hysterical activism in a way, because it's so sort of exaggerated and it's so kind of like weirdly polemic. What it's brilliant at doing is showing that terrain and showing us where all the strain and the stresses and the pitfalls are. And then maybe somebody else can have a more mature and measured debate afterwards, but it won't be me. It won't be me. But yeah, I think that's everything. I might have missed something.
No,
You'll tell me if I missed something.
That's enough.
But that's probably enough. Everyone's wilting, like, shut up, Fran, we want to go and have a sandwich.
Well, I'd love to continue this conversation actually and ask some more questions, but we've started quite a bit behind schedule, and we have to close this session very soon. And instead of adding on my part another question, I would nonetheless give the audience the opportunity to ask perhaps one or two very quick questions in the 5 remaining minutes we have at our disposal. Are there any questions?
Also me, because you called it manifesto, and I didn't get the point about the manifesto. And is the manifesto, because I just and is it are the texts, are there more texts of that, or is this the manifesto? And how is the length and the manifesto, how they are connected?
Okay, so this is the manifesto, and it's not very big. It's
15 pages.
15 short little dinky little pages, and then there's a bunch of poems that I think speak to it, hopefully in ways that are interesting and productive. It's this length because I'm not an artistic movement, I'm a single person working on my own, and I had some ideas and I wrote them all down, and I felt that I dealt with that. But in another sense, I am always revising this. So there would be, next year there would be a text that is slightly like this, that has changed in maybe 5 or 6 crucial ways as I've refined my ideas or had better ones or been challenged on some of my kind of like preconceived ideas and assumptions, usually by brilliant students who'll just be like, but have you thought about it? I'm like, oh yeah. So I like the manifesto as a form that carries great urgency. I also like it as a kind of form of, I call it like hysterical activism or hysterical theatre, because you are ranting, you're performing your rage. And I think, as a working class person, as a working class woman, like my rage is something that society for some reason is really terrified of, is really frightened of. So the idea of stepping into that space and really deliberately working with that as a poetic mode and kind of making yourself that spectacle is something that I found kind of really useful and productively unsettling in like sort of university and conference spaces. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Thank you.
There's one more question.
Do you have a testament?
Do I have a testament? A test at the last. Well, I kind of associate that with like, I'm going to die soon, so maybe when I'm on my deathbed, I'll have a testament. I have a kind of testimony, I suppose, in the sense that all of this work is a work of witnessing, if that makes sense. But I don't know that I have a testament yet. I think that's more, I feel like that's more, in all seriousness, it's more of a kind of, it's a kind of finalizing gesture. And I'm more hanging out on the periphery, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Another short question. I was wondering, do you actually study literature and work with literature students? And the other, maybe longer question is, how do you feel about the accessibility of literature per se, and maybe even events like these for working class people?
That's a really great question. I do work now. I teach poetry specifically. And I did what we're all pleased to call non-regulated community learning for a really long time. That's when anyone can come who wants to pay the nominal fee, and I will teach them. I start a new job in September, which is more academia adjacent, working on an MA. The horror. But I am going to persist with non-regulated community learning because it's the most valuable part of what I do. So yeah, I mean, I teach in various, I also do some private tuition for GCSE and A-level students who are very unsure about Chaucer and the Middle and Jacobean literature, and because that's my passion. That's not what my doctorate's in at all. It's something totally other. And what I think about events like this, they're brilliant. There's not a version of like the universe that I could have ever imagined, like, maybe 20 years ago, where somebody like me would be here talking to all, these sort of brilliant, wonderful, creative people. It's fantastic. I always think with access, it's not a question of, Arts Council England are always like, you have to appeal to the broadest group of people imaginable. There's this hypothetical ideal person that's going to be seduced into coming to arts events. It's not really their thing, so we have to make it look like something else in order to get them in. I'm like, that's not true. All people need to know is that it's for them and that they are welcome. And you can do that by advertising in spaces that actual humans actually go to. This is something that I have found out that's really, really useful. And it's the same with kids. Kids will read poetry and they will enjoy poetry if poets go into schools and say, here, look at some poetry, it's amazing. We're not going to study it, you're just going to, you're going to react to it on an organic level. It's not actually, it's not complicated, but I think a lot of people who control the purse strings are really invested in keeping it complicated. So yeah, those are my hot takes on that.
I think
we're done. Yeah. Sorry, everyone.
So let me thank you once again for your reading and your presence here. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fran. This was truly inspiring. And also thank you, Stefan, for doing a great moderation and introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for staying as well. Danke, dass ihr noch da seid und auch noch ein bisschen bleiben werdet. Der letzte Programmpunkt heute ist nämlich musikalischer Natur. Und Christel wird noch kurz soundchecken und um ungefähr 22 Uhr geht's dann los. Schnell an die frische Luft.